Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, also known as JSSJ. If you're passionate about justice, equity, and inclusion, and you're looking for a distinctly Jewish lens, USF's graduate-level JSSJ certificate program offers a powerful opportunity to grow your impact and deepen your practice. This fall, dive into Arab Jews, Histories, Politics, and Identity with Hadar Cohen. Explore the complex and vital identity of Arab Jews and what it means to understand them as an integral part of the broader Jewish world. Applications are open now through August 15th. Learn more and apply at usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 492, The Torah of the Tarot. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're exploring the connection between two things that few people know or probably even imagined have any connection at all: Judaism and tarot. Our guest today is Stav Appel, who recently taught a mini-course in the Yeshiva called The Torah in the Tarot, the lost Jewish history of the tarot. And with the help of our friends at Ayin Press, he's bringing a beautiful new tarot deck into the world, as well as an accompanying booklet that reveals the lost and forgotten Jewish origins of the tarot. The deck and booklet, also called The Torah in the Tarot, will be published this fall, and you can check it out and pre-order it from Ayin Press's website. Before we dive in, Lex, can you offer up any Judaism Unbound announcements for this week?
I absolutely can. And the main announcement this week is that we have a new member of our podcast family. We just keep on growing. We keep on having new podcasts in our Judaism Unbound family. The newest is called Door to Door, A Pilgrimage Across Generations. And it's a new podcast that follows a family, our own executive director, Miriam Turlinchamp's family, making pilgrimages to their ancestral home over the course of 8 decades. Part investigative journalism and part memoir, Door to Door explores how 4 generations of a family metabolized a history of survival, trauma, and hope, and reclaimed a story nearly erased. Door to Door, A Pilgrimage Across Generations, drops this Wednesday, July 23rd, and the trailer is already out now. You can subscribe anywhere that podcasts are found.
So let's jump into our conversation about the Torah and the Tarot. Our guest today, Stav Appel, is a data scientist and a lifelong student of Torah. Earlier in his career, he was the director of an Israeli-Palestinian coexistence organization called Nitzanei Shalom, and the director of international service programs for American Jewish World Service. Stav Appel holds an MBA from the Yale School of Management and has studied biblical Hebrew at Hebrew University and Yale Divinity School. After a chance encounter with an old deck of tarot cards, Stav Appel began to explore the origins and meaning of the biblical references he recognized in its images. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, Stav Appel, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I wanted to start as kind of a stand-in for some members of our audience. I think we have plenty of members of our audience who have tarot decks and know what to do with them. But let's talk a little bit about the people like me who really kind of have very little idea what it's all about. So could we start by just understanding what are we even talking about when we're talking about tarot?
Well, tarot in general, they're kind of known as a tool for fortune telling. That's kind of the immediate association that people think about. And when people hear the name of my project, the Torah and the Tarot, they automatically assume I am also a fortune teller. One of the really interesting parts of this project is getting people to I'm asking people to really look at the cards completely with fresh eyes and to forget for a moment that they're tools for fortune telling. I'm actually a writer and a researcher on with a very serious historical thesis that has nothing to do with fortune telling whatsoever. And in my examination of the Tarot at a particular historical period, this was long before the cards were reinvented as a tool for divination or fortune telling. When I read about tarot, that was particularly in the 1600s or the 1700s, and at that time they were primarily used for gambling and game playing.
So when I think about the tarot cards, I think about they have different images on them. Like I think of one is like the death card, right? And one is but so again, but for folks who don't really even know what we're talking about, could you describe it a little bit? And For those of us who maybe don't know a lot, but know a little, like you're saying, like think about it as fortune telling. I mean, I think like we're used to saying like if this certain card comes up, then that means that this particular thing is going to happen in your fortune. When people were using them for gambling, how would they work?
So first of all, a big question is how do you define tarot? Different people define it differently, and also there are different people who pronounce it differently. Some
Mm-hmm.
people say tarot cards, some say tarot cards. But there's in a standard deck of tarot cards, there are 78 cards, and there are 22 unique picture cards, which is kind of like a standard cast of characters. And the most famous tarot deck of all is the Raider Whitesmith deck that was made in 1909. And most people, when they imagine a tarot card, they're immediately going to conjure one of those images from the Raider Whitesmith deck. But what a lot of people don't know is that the Raider Whitesmith deck was largely inspired by a much older tradition of tarot cards, which stretched all the way back to the 1500s, if not the 1400s. And tarot is pretty much defined by these 22 standard picture cards that are now called the Major Arcana. And the Raider Whitesmith deck, the other cards are called pip cards. And originally they were just like kind of hour playing cards. So they just have a number of symbols on them. But the Raider Whitesmith deck was really known for, they actually made every card kind of a narrative picture card. My research is really on the artistic ancestor of the Raider Whitesmith deck, which is called the Tarot du Marseille. That deck was really widely known originally for gambling purposes, long before it became a tool for esoterica or the occult or fortune telling.
So that's really fascinating. I mean, I'd love to hear more about that deck in particular, but also start to open up the Torah side of the Torah of the tarot. I mean, that number 22, I think, is a good gateway in, because for the savvy listener, you might be thinking, 22, that's kind of a Jewish number. There's 22 letters in the alphabet, in the Hebrew alphabet. And maybe that's interesting. So I'd love to throw it back to you. How might we start to open up sort of the side of this that is Torah in the tarot? I've heard you speak about it before. I'm very intrigued by the arguments you make that there's actually some Jewish connections to be found in that deck that you've studied.
Let's go back in time a bit. So the Tarot de Marseille, we don't really know when it was made precisely. We do know there's a bunch of tarot card decks of tarot from the 1500s and 1600s. Tarot historians estimate there were probably about 1 million decks made at that time, but there's only less than 100 that really survive. So no one really knows who was the original designer or creator of the Tarot de Marseille. Starting in the 1700s, people began to speculate as to what was the original intent of the Tarot de Marseille. And it is surprisingly filled with a bunch of really enigmatic, puzzling images. And it really does suggest to the viewer that there's some compelling narrative. But no one's ever really been able to find a narrative that really provides a unifying, intent or story to all these characters. People have been really puzzled as why are there precisely 22 major arcana, not 21 and not 23? And very early on, there were writers that began to speculate that the key to understanding the Tarot de Marseille was from this confluence, this kind of coincidence of 22 major arcana and 22 Hebrew letters. The first writers who began to explore this, they theorized that there's some coincidence of 22 and 22. There was one author in the late 1700s that led him to believe that this was an indication that the Tarot was originally from Egypt. That was his conclusion. And this became a popular belief in what eventually became known as the occult Tarot movement. Now, a lot of occult theorists claimed that the Tarot, that it's hieroglyphics and that its roots are in ancient Egypt. And later on, people began to theorize that there was a connection between the Tarot de Marseille and Kabbalah. And when they said Kabbalah, they didn't mean the Judaic Kabbalah that we're familiar with. They kind of invented a new form of Kabbalah, an idea conceived by a writer by the name of Eliphas Levi, who was a Frenchman whose real name was Louis Constant. He wrote under the pen name Eliphas Levi, and he offered that the Tarot de Marseille was a vessel for occult Kabbalah, and that Kabbalah may have been temporarily under the ownership of Judaism, but he said it was a system for symbolic thought and spirituality that predated Judaism. And this is kind of his invention of what we now call occult Kabbalah. You could think of it as a form of Kabbalah that's been purged of its relationship to Judaism. Kind of marinates in the magical allure of Judaism and this conception of Judaism as wizards, but it's safely removed from Judaism. So one could say it's It's like a form of Kabbalah that was kind of sanitized so it could be safe for consumption by French Catholics.
Okay, so that's really interesting. I want to hear more about this, and I guess I've heard you speak about this before. You've spoken about how scholars argue pretty regularly that there are not to be found sort of particular parallels between the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and the particular tarot cards in this deck. And I've heard you, including with visuals and looking at particulars of the cards, sort of display why you think that's not quite right. And with the knowledge that our listeners are listening, they're not able to see, but we can put in the show notes visuals of some of these cards so that people can get a sense. I would actually love if you could give us a sense of the kinds of, whether it's meaning making, connection making, that could be happening from your perspective in these cards connected to Torah or, Jewishness generally. And to some degree, I'm kind of curious the so what of that. Like, let's take for a second, okay, maybe there are connections here between a classic tarot deck from a few hundred years ago and Judaism. Like, sort of cool story, but like, why does that matter? Like, what might that reflect?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me summarize how the tarot world currently views the relationship between the 22 major arcana and the 22 Hebrew letters. That kind of leads us to, hey, why is this important? Why would this be of interest to me? For many years, there was kind of a cadre of tarot theorists who were very sure, they were very adamant that there was a relationship between the 22 Hebrew letters and the 22 major arcana. And this they touted as evidence of the Kabbalistic origins of the Torah de Marseille. And again, when they said Kabbalah, they meant their occult Kabbalah, their syncretic Kabbalah. This is Eliphas Levi, Arthur Waite, Oswald Wirth, and Aleister Crowley. And then in the 20th century, a more critical crop of tarot historians arose. And probably the most famous is Michael Dummett, who was an English philosopher who also happened to be a historian of card games. He said that the occult tarot movement were, in his words, charlatans and frauds. This whole relationship between the Hebrew letters and the major arcana, it's a complete fiction and a lie. And he implied that the tarot occult authors, that they knew it was a lie, but they didn't want to let that get in the way of their theatrics and their creative writing. And if he wrote this book called The Game of Tarot, which was like the history of tarot games. And it's really entertaining how much venom he has for the tarot occult movement. He just sees them as fakes and frauds. I mean, I'll tell you how this is the story about how I stumbled upon this and why I reached the opinion that this was worth my time. So I don't come from a background of astrology or New Age mysticism. I'm actually very.
That's disappointing.
I'm sorry to disappoint you. I tell people I'm actually a surprisingly boring person. I have a business education and I spent my life doing spreadsheets. My wife happened to buy a deck of tarot cards for me to use as a game with our kids. And when I was playing with the cards, I just saw all these references to Bible stories in the tarot cards. I was just very puzzled and surprised by that. And I'm a boring person, but I'm a lifelong student of Torah. And so I'm someone who loves to study Torah. And I started reading literature on the Torah because I really wanted to know what inspired a card maker to put references to Bible stories in playing cards. I just thought that was bizarre. And when I read the quote unquote official literature, there was no acknowledgement or wrestling with this at all. Actually, they had created all these other stories about why there were these depictions of Bible stories in the cards. I thought that was such a bizarre historical blind spot, or I guess you could say a cultural blind spot. I kind of became slightly obsessed with this topic. So I started buying different versions of different tarot decks and going back into the historical record. I came to the realization that the older deck I found, the more prominent was the biblical reference. And eventually I found this deck called the Jean Noblet Tarot de Marseille, which some say is the oldest known preserved copy of the Tarot de Marseille. And in that deck, I was very shocked to find not only these biblical references, but the characters in the cards were holding their bodies in the shape of Hebrew letters. And there was one specific Hebrew letter for each card. And then I realized that someone had intentionally disguised Hebrew letters in these cards. And in these cards, you could find Judaic ritual objects, Jewish holy days, Torah stories. And when I placed these cards in their original historical context, that this particular deck had been created in France at a time when Judaism had been absolutely illegal for over 200 years. I realized that this was a secret Torah in the Torah. It was akin to finding a lost letter that had gone lost for a few centuries. I'm so passionate about sharing this story with the Jewish community because it's a letter for us. The conclusion I reached from the degree of Judaica that's ingeniously concealed in these cards, a group of scholars and artists took it upon themselves to make this absolutely fantastic secret vessel for Judaism at a time when people really doubted whether or not Judaism would still survive the trials of their time.
So could you maybe give us a little bit of one or two examples? I know it's hard to necessarily describe in words a visual object, but just so that we can get a little bit more sense of what is the Judaism that's being preserved in these cards? Like, so I understand that there's a person holding their body in the form of a Hebrew letter. Like, what else do we see on these cards?
Sure. I mean, I'll give you a really simple example. A lot of people know about the hangman, right? It's a classic card of the Torah. And there's this great genre, which I call Torah hermeneutics, of different people kind of just creatively exploring what these cards could possibly mean. The foundational article of belief of the tarot world is that these cards are able to hold or contain every possible creative interpretation. A lot of people speculate, who could the hangman be? Why is the hangman upside down? Why does he look so calm? In a lot of cards, he also looks happy. Who is this upside down hangman who's hung from a tree? But if we place the hangman in a Judaic frame of reference, so who's the famous hangman of Judaism?
Dan, I've seen Stav talk about this before, so you have to guess.
Okay, I would say Haman.
Yes, Haman. So
Boo!
Boo, exactly.
For folks not familiar, from the Book of Esther, villain guy, we'll put a link in the show notes.
So why would Haman be hung upside down? Does that ring any Purim bells for you?
I mean, Purim is a holiday where things are turned upside down.
Right, Purim's a holiday, it's upside down. In Megillat Esther, in the Scroll of Esther, there's a very particular line. Haman, they think it's the day of destruction for the Jewish people. And there's this big surprise that Haman is hung instead of Mordechai. And there's a line in Megillat Esther where it says, Nafoch meyogon l'simcha. The day was turned over from one of mourning until one of joy and happiness. And if you look at the Noble hangman, he's upside down and he's also smiling. It's literally turned over from mourning into joy. He's hung between two trees with 10 cuts of wood. You can see 10 cuts of branches because Haman was hung with his 10 sons. If you digest this card outside of a Judaic frame of reference, it's a mystery, it's an enigma. Who could this hangman possibly be? But the moment you're given permission to say, oh, no, this is Judaism, it becomes very clear very quickly who the hangman is. And by the way, you can see that his leg is held like the letter Lamed, and Lamed being the 12th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and the card number is 12. When you're given permission to see Torah in the Torah, it's a guide to the letters of Hebrew, to the Jewish holy days, Judaic ritual objects, and Torah stories. It's like a secret hidden curriculum to the basics of Judaism.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to flash to our own time. We'll go back, we'll jump back and forth to the historical era in which this was created and now. I'd love to dive into just okay, so you're now creating a deck that is going to be released through iImpress.
Yes,
it's coming soon. It's a deck and a booklet, and people will be able to use these things. Now, I'm curious, your use cases, basically. You've mentioned a couple of times, to a point that some of our listeners might be agitated. They might like the fortune telling, and you're saying, "Oh, I'm not a fortune teller." We're neutral here on if folks want to be our Judaism Unbound verse person who is the fortune teller with tarot cards, shoot us an email. But we have these cards now that you are making a deck for, and we can use them. And I guess I'm curious, how might you imagine that people actually use these? End of the day, we're a podcast about creative new expressions of Judaism in our time, envisioning new forms of Jewish practice, Judaism. How might tarot cards be part of that? What are some potential ways that in our own time we can tie to, the Bible stories like the Book of Esther that are being brought up in the stories, but also to the historical memory of these folks who created the tarot decks themselves?
So that's a wonderful question. It opens up a lot of interesting topics. So first of all, I need to make a confession about something, in that I'm adamantly convinced 100% that the Jean Nouble Tower de Marseille contains a systematically intentional depiction of Judaism. For me, it's beyond a debate. It's too robust to say otherwise. The second part of my thesis is that this depiction of Judaism was used as a tool for secret Jewish education. I have no proof for that. That second part is actually me speculating. I really don't have proof for that. And one of the things I've really learned from this project is that Judaism is really a moving object. It's a constantly evolving entity. There's a lot of contemporary Jews, particularly rabbis, who are a bit in denial to our wild origins, our wild roots, or our wild past. Because when you read the history of Judaism from the 1500s and 1600s, they were very much into divination, and actually what we would probably call magic. I personally was very shocked to learn that. Like in my research, I was shocked to what extent there was a lot of fortune telling going on in the Jewish community. I'll give you an example. I was reading the diaries of Rabbi Chaim Vital, one of the great sages of Kabbalah. He wrote a book called Sefer Chazanot, the Book of Visions. And in the Book of Visions, it opens up with his descriptions of his visits to fortune tellers. And he goes to different fortune tellers, and they put drops of oil in a glass, and they'll read him his fortune from the movement of the drops of oil, and they all tell him he's going to be a great king of Israel, or even the Messiah. So it is very possible that the cards actually were originally used for divination in a Jewish framework. I could talk further about why I don't think so, but I could be wrong. I might be projecting my Judaism on the cards in that sense. Now, to your question about how can we use them today, when I present this thesis to a lot of people, they say, well, obviously that's wrong because fortune telling and tarot cards and divination are forbidden in Judaism.
There's never been a Jew who breaks Jewish rules. Never heard of them. We swear.
Well, I mean, we break the rules in the Bible itself. I mean, there is divination in the Bible. Now, what's forbidden, you're not allowed to do divination through the power of idols or foreign gods. So if I tell your fortune, but I ascribe all the power to God, that's kosher. But if I read your fortune and I say, oh, it's from the sun, or it's from some alien god, that's avodah zarah. That's idol worship. That's the differentiation. A lot of contemporary Jews, maybe, I don't know, we want to kind of sweep that under the carpet. A lot of people are reinventing Judaism to be this hyper-rationalistic faith. They're kind of recreating Judaism to what they want it to have been, but that really is not the truth. So the question is, well, what do we do with it now? I've heard one rabbi say that he sees it as a midrash machine where you can just deal the cards, and if you know the characters, it tells a story, and it's a catalyst for telling the stories. Quite honestly, I don't know what people are going to do with it. My contribution is I want to share the story of what I see just an amazing story of Jewish creativity and resilience and survival. And I expect other people are going to find ways to use it creatively. In the book that I'm publishing from Ayin, I've given a very simple reading of the cards. I say I've done the pshat, the simple, kind of the most rudimentary reading. If you spend a good time with the cards, there are many additional layers of meaning. And I suspect other people are going to find a lot more in the cards that I missed.
So we haven't had a chance to put our hands on it yet, or at least I haven't. I just want to describe it a little bit or ask you. So it's a deck. It's actually a tarot deck in a box. And is it the traditional, that oldest version? Is it just a replica of that one, the cards themselves, and then you have a book that does an interpretation of each card?
Yeah, so it's a box. It's a beautifully done box. Ian did a wonderful job. It is a historically accurate reproduction of the Jean Nouble Tower de Marseille. So it's all 78 cards. And it has a book with what I would describe it as a very concise tour of all the concealed Judaica that can be found in the cards. A challenge here is that when I wrote it, I don't have an answer key, right? I don't really definitively know whether or not my interpretation is the correct one. I'm really sure that the hangman is Haman. But then I go a lot deeper into very minute details, and I basically just say, listen, I gave myself permission to interpret this work of art through a Judaic frame of reference. And at a certain point, it's really up to the reader to decide what I got right and where I became a victim of either my imagination, or they'll have to decide when I became a victim of my imagination or not. Because again, we don't know for sure.
I do want to take that and run with it. Like, I have looked at these cards. I agree with the identifications you draw, the correspondences that you found between them and Jewish characters, Hebrew letters. Let's pretend somehow it's all wrong. Like, there's no Jewish anything in the historical sense, that like people intentionally created these cards in order to be drashing on Jewish text or connecting to Jewish tradition, Jewish holidays, Jewish text. Let's hold that for a second. I would argue like that does not at all mean that we couldn't still ourselves find Jewish meaning in them. This gets to actually a really important claim of our podcast and how we go about finding Jewish meaning in the world. Like, a lot of people think that the project of Judaism is to take the like demarcated Jewish holidays and texts and like officially authorized Jewish things. Then we read them, or we look at them, or we touch them, or we celebrate them, whatever the noun is. We do those verbs to it. So we celebrate a Hanukkah that we've inherited, or we read the book of Esther that we've inherited. All of that. I think the Jewish act can just as much be almost the improv game of like, there's this thing in my house. What's the Jewish meaning in it? It's like you look at various objects or text, and I'm thinking in the card game world, like, was Magic the Gathering made to be a Jewish commentary? I don't think so. Magic the Gathering being like a very popular card game that builds in fantastical elements. It's very different from tarot cards, but like it's drawing on traditions of like creatures and powerful beings distilled in cards, and it's a very popular nerdy game. I actually have plenty of times picked up a Magic the Gathering card, looked at it, and be like, this feels like it's talking to a Jewish story. Some of them actually are directly like featuring like beings or creatures that also appear in Jewish texts. Some of them aren't, but I'm just like, oh, I'm familiar with something that feels similar to this. And then could I look at a few Magic the Gathering cards and have them talk to each other and build a Jewish story out of it? I believe I could. And I think more than could, actually, maybe we should. Maybe that's actually part of what it is to be Jewish today, is do that work. And so my question going back to you is like, even for those who are skeptical of you, like there are listeners out there, sadly, who are not going to be convinced by your take. What would you say even to them in terms of how they could find some juiciness here?
Well, first, let's acknowledge that there would and should be skeptics. If I heard this story, I would be very skeptical too, because it sounds, what I'm describing sounds too fantastical to be true. So I don't begrudge anyone who brings a skeptic's eye to this story. But back to your wonderful question, it's such a classic Jewish question, and I'll just give you examples how we wrestle with this all the time in Judaism. Think of the Zohar. There are a lot of people who debate, was the Zohar written in the 12th century or was the Zohar written in the 3rd century or the 2nd century?
Just like 1,000 years between friends.
Right.
You know?
Some people have their heart set on the fact that it was actually written by Shimon ben Yochai in the 2nd century. A lot of people say, no, that's a fraud. It was written in the 12th. It's obviously written in the 12th century. And for a lot of people, that makes a huge difference. For a lot of people, it makes no difference at all, because it's, one way or another, it's a Judaic work of art, and it's part of that ongoing Jewish conversation. In Judaism, there's this great tradition of always of writing books and ascribing them to older authors, right? Another example is the Sefer Yetzirah. It was, scholars say it was written in the 4th century or 6th century, but they say it was written by Abraham. It was written by a much older author. Someone could say the Torah itself was obviously written later, and they ascribed it to Moses, and some people say that's a sacrilegious idea. The stories of the Torah, we know that many of them were some degree inspired by older stories that came beforehand. Think of Kabbalah. So much of Kabbalah was clearly inspired by Neoplatonic thought. It has been in kind of a secret but completely kosher Jewish tradition to absorb ideas and stories and works of art from outside and make them our own. So yeah, I agree. I agree with the premise of your question, which is, yeah, even if it wasn't Jewish, we're allowed to digest it. But I'm not a storyteller. I'm not a myth maker. I'm actually kind of right angle kind of guy. I have not written a poem or a creative interpretation. I've written what I believe is a historical based thesis.
Well, I was kind of going to ask, like, what genre do you put your own work into? Like, is it history? Is it kind of midrash? It makes me think about the podcast that I really love. It's called A Podcast of Biblical Proportions. And it explores all these possibilities of what the stories of the Torah might have come from. For example, I mean, one that really hit me was that he talks about the story of the sack of Babylon, which I didn't really know much about. And that it turns out that the Persians, when they were sacking Babylon, they diverted the waters of the Tigris or the Euphrates, I don't remember which one. And as a result, the river went down, and that was how they were able to get access into Babylon. And he says, that must be the source of the story of the parting of the Red Sea. And I remember saying to him, I don't know if this is historically correct or not, but I want it to be true because it's a much better story to me about how that story might have come into existence. And yes, he's doing historical research, but the reality is that nobody really knows. And so do we call that history or do we call that something else?
So yes, and actually that one example you cited, if you read, I guess we call it mythology. That's not such a great word, but there are many legends and stories from that part of the world which may have in some ways inspired or influenced the Torah. I don't really know what the name for the genre for what I wrote is. I mean, I guess someone would say it's hermeneutics, interpretation. The challenge of defining it, of categorizing it, is actually a problem for me, because when I speak with academics, or when I've tried to publish in a more formal academic environment, people want to know my sources. And I don't have any sources. I don't fit in. I am the primary source. So I often joke that academics will properly explore this topic only when I die and I can become their source. I will be the footnote that will give people permission to write about this seriously.
I feel like I'm going to be sitting with that. I also like that the word source sounds like sorcerer, given the conversation we're having. You had a really profoundly honest moment earlier that I don't want to just skirt past, and I think it's come up at other moments in this conversation. You said, I might be projecting my Judaism onto the cards.
Yes.
Earlier in this conversation. And we've been trained to see that as bad or dishonest, at least from the perspective, again, of Western truth seeking and history seeking. We've been taught that no, you don't want to read who you are. You don't want to read into the text all of your assumptions, all of your presumptions. That's actually, not the point. If you want to understand the Torah, you shouldn't read into it. You should read out from it. Mm-hmm. And I like both. I inside out, outside in. I don't know. I think that there's a place for both. And I really appreciate that you're naming the ways in which reading in, reading our own identities, questions, assumptions, etc., in to whether it's Torah text, whether it's tarot cards, whether it's something else, that does just sort of happen naturally. Dan and I mean, we're talking about, the truth or not of the historical truth or not of Bible stories. Dan and I have conversations where I've said, I do actually kind of want the text of the Torah in the way some people want it to be true, because that sort of serves spiritual meaning for them in certain ways. I actually want it not to be historically true. My theology, my relationship to this body of literature is that it is literature. And I actually gain a lot of meaning out of the fact that people fashioned these stories as opposed to they happened and we wrote it down. I find that less compelling. That okay, so we were in Egypt and then there was a slave revolt and we left and we wrote it down. That's cool, I guess. But what's much cooler to me is, wow, I'm part of a group of people that didn't experience that, but fashioned a story that is deeply meaningful to many different kinds of people in many different geographies in many places. They chose to do that. That's actually a cool thing to me. And I'm aware that when I read biblical scholarship, when I read different back and forth debates about did this happen, did it not, is there a kernel of truth? My bias is to see not a kernel of truth. And that makes me in 50-50 situations where I could say maybe there's something that really happened here historically. Maybe it leads me to lean on the other side. That doesn't make me right. It just means that I am reading in to some degree to the text. Now, people tend to use the phrase reading in when folks are more traditionalist and they're trying to read in God's truth or whatever into this text. But I guess I'm curious, Should we be reading into these tarot cards? Should we be reading out from them? How do you understand the interpretive acts we're doing and their directionality, I guess?
So that's an extremely beautiful question. Here we're kind of stepping away from my very simple historical thesis to deeper waters. And I always get a little wary because I kind of feel like I'm now not going to start speaking above my pay grade. So I'm going to say what I'm going to say, but this is me speaking as an individual. Your relationship to Torah is very similar to my own. I see the Torah as an artifact from a time in which they had yet to invent a distinction between fact and fiction. Myth and history were one and the same. I believe when you're allowed to see history through the lens of myth, there's actually something more true and more human than our attempt to pretend that we can really capture an objective truth. So for me, the Torah in that way is, I wouldn't use the word accurate, but it's more of a powerful history book than kind of the correct, quote unquote, true history. So for me, the Torah stories are kind of like, in some ways, they're like hieroglyphics. Like they're trying to tell a very complex story in very few words. And the power of these Torah stories is that because they're conveying so much in so few words, that they're able to convey very different stories to different people. So some people need to know, or some people want to hear that the waves of the Red Sea literally parted, whereas other people have the ability and the freedom to interpret that in a completely different way. Intentional or not, the Torah does that on an even more profound level, where it brings these stories to a new level of abstraction. I don't know if that was the intent of the artists or if that's just an accidental byproduct. But for me, it has certainly enriched my capacity to read Torah through alternative lenses of interpretation or approach them from additional perspectives.
Some of this conversation is making me think about a product, a deck of cards that came out, I think, a couple of years ago that one of our previous guests, David Zvi Kalman, who does all these creative things. He's a book publisher, but he also has created, 20-sided dreidel, all kinds of cool stuff. And one of the things that he did a few years ago was commissioned, I believe, 4 different artists to create art for the 4 different suits of a standard deck of cards. But they tell the story of the Book of Esther on the cards, like through each card is meant to be a part of the story of the Book of Esther. And the card deck bills itself as a shuffled and wordless book.
Oh, it's beautiful.
And, it also connects to that whole idea that we were talking about Purim, that it's turned over, it's turned upside down, it's shuffled, right? So a book that is not in order would kind of make sense for Purim. So in a certain sense, it's its own work of art, and it's its own attempt to interpret Purim in some fashion. But as I'm listening to you describe this, I'm imagining in a couple 100 years, somehow the box that says it's a shuffled and wordless book, or the box that says it's the deck of Esther, is lost. And yet these cards remain, and people just start using it for gambling or something. They forget that it's even Jewish. And then, Stav Appel Jr. comes along and is telling us that this is actually a Jewish thing. I don't know. I'm curious about how you think about the creation of things in our own time that might be analogous to what that tarot deck was when it was created.
Yeah, so my thesis basically is that there was an old, we know that in Italy and France, gambling with playing cards was very popular. And I believe, and there was an Italian deck of playing cards called Triumphi cards or parade cards. And I argue that some artists at some point realized that they could hijack those cards and reinvent them as a tool for secret Jewish education. Again, that's my personal conclusion. But someone decided to hijack those Italian images and recreate them as a vehicle for Judaism. And then what happened is, because those cards were so enigmatic and interesting looking, people began to copy them and reproduce them. And for whatever reason, it took off. It took off as the deck to gamble with. And then over generations, copy after copy after copy, there's kind of this moment of alchemy. You combine Judaism with gambling, and it kind of created this explosion that produced the contemporary tarot. And even if you look at tarot cards today, you can still see all these faint echoes, all these Jewish symbols. It's like a game of telephone. It got distorted. It's like a copy of a copy distorted them. So yeah, exactly. If someone took that deck of cards you have in your hand right now, it's openly Jewish. But if for some reason that became popular and people began to copy it, and they had to make new copies because the cards deteriorated or cards got lost. In 2 or 3 generations, people may not remember it was once Jewish, and they would create an alternative myth to explain what it was. That basically is what I believe happened. People could no longer say it was Jewish; they said it was Kabbalah.
What an amazing sentence, by the way. That they're not sure it's Jewish, it's Kabbalah. That reflects a lot.
There's so much in that. There's so much history in that sentence. In the 1500s, Kabbalah became very popular, and there became this rise of Christian Kabbalah with Pico Mirandola and Ruchlin and other scholars. And then Eliphas Levi came a century later, or 2 centuries later, and he invented the occult, the syncretic Kabbalah. And to this day, the word Kabbalah, I call it a very expensive spiritual real estate. Everyone really wants to own Kabbalah, and there's lots of people who have Kabbalah schools or different forms of Kabbalah. It's a very valuable word. People really want to own it because it has such powerful connotations. So they wanted Kabbalah to be in the cards, but not Judaism.
So I really want to dwell in what to me is like a spiritual act. Some would say a transgressive act. I don't even really see it as that transgressive, but I think some people would. But of taking something that is seen as Jewishly forbidden, the way you were talking about, like people say, oh, well, magic, divination, the Torah says you can't do that. It's not Jewish. Like taking specifically, davka, things that are forbidden according to certain measurements of Jewish tradition, Jewish law, etc., and then doing it Jewishly. I don't know. My sense is that's not what happened with tarot as you understand it. Like, I don't know that the people creating this were like, they're saying that you can't do tarot cards Jewishly, and so we're going to do it. I don't know that that's what happened historically, but I do think that practice of looking at Jewish history, at looking at Jewish text in the Torah, and sort of naming those who didn't win the debates through, okay, so the rabbis or whoever, they decided that certain kinds of magic are forbidden. There's a lot of evidence, as you mentioned, that people were doing it anyway. And they were Jews. And they weren't somehow like less part of our ancestral Jewishness than those who were following the rules that became enshrined. And so I actually feel this is reminding me of when we had a conversation about the Treifa banquet, like the people who, well, so there was the original Treifa banquet that was not so conscious, but there was Treifa banquet 2.0, where there was sort of a debate between people who wanted to eat food that was unkosher. Some just wanted to do it like, oh, it's fine for Jews to not keep kosher laws. Others wanted to say, specifically, eating non-kosher food is a way of declaring our form of Jewish connection, and that like we connect to Judaism without keeping kashrut and we do other ways. That feels potentially like what some people could do with these cards and say, you know what? There are a set of things that Jewish tradition and interpreters of that tradition have marked as forbidden. And we actually don't know that they got it right. We're going to celebrate. We're going to find pieces of Jewish historical memory, like this tarot deck, that from some people's perspective are against the rules. And we're going to specifically celebrate those. Some would argue that what I'm saying is pretty like Sabbatian. It's pretty like in the name of Shabtai Tzvi, who actually is pretty close chronologically to the time period we're describing with these tarot cards. So part of me is interested about that. But like, can you just sort of give us a window into how you relate to that question of making something Jewish that others specifically see as forbidden?
I don't know if you intended, but it opens up a lot of very interesting historical doors. Because this, if I'm correct, this deck was made in the 1500s and 1600s, and it was made for a very specific audience, crypto Jews. These were Jews who were outwardly Catholic and were secretly Jewish. So these were people who were actively engaged in Jewish transgression all the time. Crypto Jews, they struggled to create some symbolic thread of Judaic observance, but largely they maintained, outwardly in the public, they had non-Jewish lives. The crypto Jewish community people were afraid to transgress. They thought that God would immediately punish them if they violated the commandments. A true Orthodox communities, people observe the commandments out of fear. And these people had genuine fear about violating the commandments of the Torah. And suddenly they were violating the commandments all the time, and many of them did not suffer divine justice right away. Nowadays, people don't talk about it, but in the Jewish world at this time, there was tension between the Talmudists, where like people who thought that Judaism, first and foremost, is about the observance of the commandments as defined by the Talmud. And there was this growing kind of active spiritualism, which we could call the Kabbalists, really largely inspired by the Zohar, where they began to interpret the stories of the Torah far more creatively. And in the origins of Kabbalah, a lot of people had fear that if people started interpreting the stories creatively, they might start interpreting the commandments creatively as well. There were many crypto Jews who were particularly attracted to Kabbalah, and people began to more and more interpret the Torah allegorically, but they also were very much in the grip of messianic fever. They expected a great grand redemption at any moment. The punchline here is that because so many people began to transgress the law just by virtue of being crypto Jews, I believe it is fair to argue that this actually set the stage for the arrival of Sabbatai Tzvi. Some people say that Sabbatai Tzvi showed up, he was this great heretic, and he destroyed all the law. Gershom Shalom hints at this, that no, the crypto-Jewish community was already ready for someone to come and break these laws, that they were primed for a great heretical Messiah to arrive. And when you look at the tarot cards, and this is where I have to be humble. I might be projecting my Judaism on the cards. When you look at the cards, there's a lot of nudity in the cards. There's a card that's a visual depiction of the Shekhinah, which is the feminine divine presence. That's very heretical. So there's this great puzzle. It's like, it's an outward open display of one of the greatest secrets of Judaism. So it's like a secret, it's like a secret wrapped up in a disguise, openly displayed. So even if that's a tool for Jewish education, isn't it a heretical tool for Jewish education? And Judaism at that time was wildly messianic. It was deeply imbibed with magical thinking. What you're describing is that, hey, there's something transgressive in this work of art that may have been intentional. There may have been another spiritual agenda in these images. They do surely predate Sabbatai Tzvi, but I do think they come from the same soil that eventually greeted Sabbatai Tzvi with open arms.
So all of this is so fascinating. I'm just thinking that like maybe a place to conclude is just to give us a few more examples of some of the cards that are especially striking that instantiate some of what you're describing here, just so that we can sort of have the image to leave this conversation with.
And reminder to listeners, we've got these in the show notes so you can look at them.
Right. So I'll give you another description. Each one of the 22 picture cards has a really beautiful and complex Jewish story to tell. But I'll give you just one other example. Everyone knows the moon card. It's one of the most famous cards. It shows a moon, and there are two buildings, and there's two animals, and they kind of look like two dogs, and there's a lobster and a body of water. So if you go to the Jean Nouvel version, there's a moon, there's two buildings, and there's kind of like this red paint on the two buildings. And the two animals, if you look closely, one of them is a dog and one of them is a lamb. And there's a lobster, kind of a strange looking lobster in the water. It's a Passover card. And I'll tell you why. So on Passover, there are the 10 plagues. And in this card, there's a storm of hail in the sky. And you can see there's a moon in the sky that's being obscured because there's the plague of darkness. There's a lobster in the water. Why is there a lobster? The old French word and Spanish word for lobster is logusta. I'm probably mispronouncing that. And logusta is actually a synonym for the word locust. So why is there a lobster? It's a locust in the water. And there's a famous line in the Torah that on the night of the killing of the firstborn, the dogs barked all night long amongst the Egyptians, but no dog would sharpen their tongue amongst the Israelites. So you can see there's a dog barking. The other animal is a lamb. And on Passover night, we sacrifice a lamb, and there are two, on that night, you're supposed to put blood on the mezuzot, on the doorposts, and there's these two doorposts with blood smeared on the doorposts. And if you look in the water, you can actually see the tops of 3 pieces of matzah floating in the water. The body of water itself is in the shape of a mem sofit, and the lobster itself is in the shape of a tzadik sofit. Mem and Sadik are the first two letters in the Hebrew word for Egypt, which is Mitzrayim. It's also the first two letters of the Hebrew word for matzah. And this is I'm going to start slipping into my interpretation. Someone stuffed all this Judaica in this tiny little card so it could be a teaching device. And they could use that card as a device from which, hey, let me tell you about the story of Passover. And all the little details would remind the teacher of all the things they should be teaching people. And as I tell people, if I really had the time to walk someone through all the cards, it would probably take us about 3 days. And if you had the patience to listen to me, just ramble on about what's in the cards, after those 3 days, you would know every Hebrew letter, you would know all the major Jewish holidays, and you would know the core stories of the Torah, the foundational stories of Judaism.
Thank you so much, Stav, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity of sharing this story with others.
And we're thrilled that you are sharing it with our audience. Thanks again to all of you out there for listening. And we hope that you'll continue journeying with us into future episodes, including next week with Mandy McGlynn, where we'll continue this little mini unit on tarot and its connections to Judaism. We want to close things out by encouraging you to be in touch with us. But before we do, a reminder that we have another new addition to our Judaism Unbound family of podcasts. We're growing rapidly, this family of ours. And the newest podcast in that family is called Door to Door, a pilgrimage across generations. And yes, if you're thinking, door to door, is that related to Ledorva Door, generation to generation? The answer is certainly. So we hope that you'll check out this incredible podcast hosted by our executive director, Miriam Turlinchamp. And we also hope, as always, that you'll be in touch with us. And here are the different ways that you can do that. First, there's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find our show notes, which, as we mentioned, is super useful for this episode, given the visual connections. But you can also check out all sorts of other things, show notes for our other episodes, amazing connections for different holidays, all sorts of goodies at JudaismUnbound.com. You can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. And if you feel called, we're super appreciative for those who are able to support us financially with either a monthly recurring donation or a one-time gift, which you can send via JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.